Got a happy song for you this week. I took you away from that dismal and sad Sweeney Todd for a change. That's because it's spring, and I like spring, and I'm feeling good, I suppose. Also because it's about Annie, Little Orphan Annie, and we're going back to the Herbert Hoover era, so we may as well be prepared for Little Orphan Annie again. I do have some good news. I'm going to give you one story of good news. The Supreme Court upholds the prisoner's rights in mental cases. The United States Supreme Court, believe it or not, in a vote of 5-4, said that prisoners have the same constitutional protections as other citizens, and they cannot involuntarily be committed to mental hospitals. They have the right before commitment. That's something. The only problem is that they can be drugged before the hearing and be like vegetables so that they really don't have the free will to know whether or not they want to be committed. The big question is, what do they eat before the hearing? But in theory, it works out fine. I saved the life of Robert Hyde. Many of you know that story, and he was a prisoner whose name I got from Jack Kimbrough, a researcher on the Robert Kennedy assassination, and it was Sirhan's lawyer, Mr. Hansen, that told Kimbrough that Hyde was going to have a lobotomy. He was in Soledad prison, and he was going to be sent to Vacaville, where the CIA was working on mind control programs, and they still do it there. It's a mental hospital in California for the intelligence community and the prison community, and Hyde was scheduled for a lobotomy there because he knew too much about the Robert Kennedy assassination, or that's what he was told. And there were several contracts out on his life, and I was lucky enough or able to move to stop those, and also to stop the lobotomy by calling the warden, Mr. Clonan, and threatening to sue Vacaville prison if they did it to him. He was put in that mental wing, and the lobotomy was stopped. Robert got out, and many of you have been to the house, and you've seen my huge Raggedy Ann. I have a 4-foot or 5-foot Raggedy Ann he sent me when he got out of prison for saving him. You remember Raggedy Ann. She was all heart. But the point is that prisoners are sent against their wishes to these mental hospitals, and then once they're in, many are programmed to become killers and have electrode implants. This is what I believe happened to Dennis Sweeney, who killed Alan Lowenstein that we talked about last week. They're thrown into these mental hospitals, and they don't have a choice. And at least the Supreme Court is saying that they can't just involuntarily throw them into a place like that. There has to be a hearing about the commitment. Speaking of commitment, there's new evidence coming in about David Berkowitz, another fellow who described himself as the son of Sam, when the actual son of Sam, the neighbor living next to Mr. Berkowitz, was involved in the murders in New York City several summers ago. Authorities are looking into what they call the loose ends, that a witness saw a yellow Volkswagen speeding from the scene of at least 6 of the shootings that have been charged to David Berkowitz, and David's car was parked at the time. He got a parking ticket at the time of the last murder. This was a Volkswagen driven by a man, and it was chased through the streets of Brooklyn by a motorist who was near the scene where Stacy Moskowitz was murdered July 31st, 1977. The witness said the man he saw had long, straight hair. David Berkowitz has stocky, curly hair, and Miss Moskowitz, was sitting in her car with her boyfriend, who was wounded at the time of the attack. David Berkowitz was overseas and in the service, writing letters home to a girlfriend, objecting to the war, wanting to get out and be part of the peace movement, and then he was put into hospitals and turned into a zombie, to the point where he insisted he acted alone for these murders in New York City, and actually people with descriptions other than his were seen at the scene of the crime. And the man that he complained about, this Sam Carr, his neighbor Yonkers, who he said he was controlled by his dog and heard voices, this neighbor had 2 sons. One was killed on an Army base last year, and another was killed hit-run case this year. And the one that was killed on the Army base was a friend of David Berkowitz and fit the description of a person doing some of the murders. One of the investigators that tried to open this up this last year was punished for doing that, fired and reprimanded, but the case is still being investigated, and evidently somebody saw a car leaving and saw a description of the murderer, and even though David Berkowitz said he did them, the murderers are still at large, or the murder. There has to be a team. When this is covered so carefully, It has to be a well-developed plot. And speaking of plots, there was a article in the newspaper that most of you probably wouldn't even notice. I don't know if it was carried in your papers at all, but it interested me, and it involved a friend of mine, somebody who's still my friend. The article in the San Francisco Chronicle this week described the death of a man who said he was going to commit suicide, David W. Olson. He had an accident, he was shot, and it left him crippled. He had a severed spinal cord and eye damage. The San Jose Mercury described the same story but left out a part of the information which is essential to understanding this case. There was a conference of Mormons in Utah several years ago in 1977, and a friend of mine, Doug Wallace, an attorney, was trying to get blacks into the Mormon church as priests and members of the church, having more than just a membership role. And he was staying with a Mr. Fitzgerald in Utah. And at the time of the meeting that weekend, it was early in the morning, Saturday night or early Sunday morning, a policeman was stalking out the house of Mr. Fitzgerald with the purpose, obviously the purpose, of murdering Doug Wallace, who had come to Utah at this time. But a plainclothesman from the police department, David W. Olson, was going up to the house probably for the same purpose of getting Doug Wallace. And one cop didn't recognize the plainclothesman as a plainclothesman and shot him and paralyzed him. So he was wounded by another member of the Salt Lake City Police Department. And the San Francisco Chronicle, interestingly enough, said that on April 3rd, 1977, they were staking out excommunicated Mormon dissident Doug Wallace near a Salt Lake City residence on the morning of the church conference. Olson left some notes, again those famous suicide notes, and he said that he would die, that he left them on a tape and made funeral arrangements. But the man who shot Olson evidently had orders to shoot. The one who shot him and paralyzed him was never punished, and he's still on the police force. But Olson, in his mind, knows what they were going to do to Doug Wallace, and now he's gone. On tape number 266, that goes way back to April the 25th, 1977, Doug Wallace was on my program on KLRB, and it's on the tape. Some of you have it, or you can order it, where he talks about the attempted shooting on his life. We did another tape December 1977, December the 4th, tape number 298, on trying to file a suit. He's a lawyer in Texas to exhume the body that's allegedly Howard used. We wanted to file this suit saying that it's Vance Cooper buried in that grave in Houston, Texas. I've known Doug for a long time. He came through here about a month ago, and he got a trailer, and he's traveling around the country for a while. But his life was spared when one policeman shot the other plainclothes policeman. But that's the way Murderville, USA goes. That's why I'm keeping track of so many judges and lawyers and civil rights spokesmen that are murdered, because they are planned and they are worked out with the police department of the city, the Salt Lake Police Department, the Mormon Church. They were all in on this murder attempt of Doug Wallace, and now one of the people involved who was shot instead of Doug just died this week. It is really a tragic waste of energy that people that study history can't apply it or learn by the past experiences, and they have to go through such tragic events over and over again. We're out now marching this next week against the nuclear buildings that were to be constructed in California. This is an anniversary of the first year of 3 Mile Island, and some of the old community people will be marching one more time. We worked together during the anti-war movement, and we're at San Francisco at Kezar Stadium in 1967, and now we're on the brink of another war and nuclear holocaust, or the leakage of nuclear plants without any provision of what to do with the waste, and we will be out there marching. And as we march, there's one gentleman who will be sure to take care of the protesters as soon as he can. The Scientologist, the Church of Scientology, has printed copies of the speeches of Adolf Hitler on what to do with radicals and law and order, which were used by the Central Intelligence Agency during the last war in Vietnam. And when Ronald Reagan saw people protesting him in New York City just last week, he spoke up, and there were signs Reagan wants war. And this is a famous quote, as of just last week, of Ronald Reagan. I'll tell you something, you jokers, if I did want war, you'd be where I'd start it. You people around the country don't know what 8 years of Reagan was here, to the anti-war movement, to the protesters, to the mental hospitals, to the prisons and the violence in the prisons. And all of his team are working their way up. So watch out for Ronald Reagan, no matter who runs against him. Get people to register and go to the polls. Reagan is now in the hands of the New York Central Intelligence Agency, the Trilateral, the Defense Department. He always was. But when he fired his group that got him into that position after his success in the primaries in New Hampshire, he took on William Casey. Now, William Casey is a one-time chairman of the Security Exchange Commission. Of course, that thing was so corrupt with all kinds of stock manipulations, it's hard to know who was behind the corruption there and how far it goes. He was in the OSS and then in the Central Intelligence Agency. Casey was chief of secret intelligence in Europe, which is the Reinhardt-Gehlen operation. Gehlen brought in the Tsars, the White Russians, called the Vaslov's army and the Solidarists, and they went down to Monaco and to Paris and into Germany and set up Adolf Hitler with the British right-wing fascist group. And after the Russian Revolution, with Herbert Hoover and American fascists, they armed Hitler for the next war. And when that war was over, they brought those people back to this country and around the world to get ready for World War III. And the Tsarist group worked in the Hoover Tower because Herbert Hoover was instrumental in getting them out of Eastern Europe and into the United States. And they worked at Stanford University, and that part I've mentioned would be part of Ronald Reagan's cabinet. Reagan now has Mr. William Casey working for him. William Casey also was part of the campaign of Thomas Dewey in New York City in the 40s. Dewey went on to be the first candidate for presidency run by the Central Intelligence Agency and a group, the Mary Carter Paint Company, that went down to the Bahamas and became Resorts International Intertel. Again, the linking of organized crime and the Nazi organizations. And this Casey is going to be that, he'll be Reagan's John Mitchell. Running affairs in New York City, Nixon will be living next door to Rockefeller, but Reagan has taken on that New York ability now with the far right wing that was held by Nelson Rockefeller. Rockefeller was too liberal for these people. Chase Manhattan was too liberal, and they're out. And this is the year of the Gehlen agents, and the aerospace, the Westinghouse, the military, the Defense Industry Security Command. Also, William Casey is very active in Catholic organizations and Catholic charities, and of course the use of the Vatican for espionage and spy control and the links to these czars and Polish fascists is very important, particularly John Paul II as Pope now. So Ronald Reagan is connected now east and west between the Stanford Hoover Library and the fascists that are there and the Stanford research and the mind control people. Now he's linked across this great nation to the New York Security Exchange, the stock market group that will manipulate him if they can to become president. Then out of the woodwork will come some of the meanest fascists that you've ever seen that are laying dormant, waiting for him, and he's a very passive Führer because they will do the dirty work and he will be their front man. Jack Anderson has 2 articles this week I don't want to lose sight of in case you don't get his papers. I'm surprised that he's not synchronized more around the country, but he has one on the U.S. ties with the Shah. This is a report by Representative George Hansen from Idaho, the Republican that went to Tehran 2 times. There are 2 committee chairmen. I'm giving you their names: Edward Bolin from Massachusetts and Henry Roos from Wisconsin, and they're investigating the relationship of Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, William Rogers, and former CIA Director Richard Helms. Jack Anderson describes, as of March 25, 1980, the lengthy, incestuous, perhaps illegal relationship of the Shah with top policymakers in Washington. I only ask the question, how in the world did Henry Kissinger become head of the National Security Council under the administration of Richard Nixon and carry on the wars he did and the policies against Salvador Allende or his policies with Iran. Henry Kissinger had this dual role and incestuous relationship all the time. He was a protege of the Rockefellers and Chase Manhattan. He married a woman who was on a paid salary of Chase Manhattan. He's a board member of the Chase Manhattan Bank, and that bank got $20 million a year from the Shah of Iran, raising the oil revenues. That was after King Faisal was killed, and I mentioned that before. Kissinger went to see him in Saudi Arabia, and the next, within a couple of days, he was dead, and he wanted to keep the price of oil down. But with the oil price going up, the profits go to Chase Manhattan. So you get a government, according to Mr. Hansen, where the president knew the hostages would be taken, but allowed the seizure of the embassy because the Shah had to get in the United States. That Chase Manhattan tied up money that they would have drawn out, that Iran could have drawn out, to prevent billions of dollars being taken out of their particular bank, that papers have been turned over to the Soviet Union and the Iranian government when the embassy was overturned that didn't have to go. They've allowed this country to go down the drain, and the hostages could have been out by last November. All they needed is a Watergate-type investigation into America and Iran. But America and Iran equals Standard Oil Rockefeller profits, and it also profits Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger's protege, General Haig, will, I'm sure, run as vice president under Ronald Reagan, so all bases are covered. The military is happy, and then you again have Rockefeller, Kissinger control in the White House because Haig will be their man if Reagan takes him as vice president. It's interesting that Jack Anderson is writing these stories. He's writing about that William Rogers, Secretary of the State at one time, an important man with foreign policy, who as soon as he stepped down from his job became a part of the Bank of Omran, the Shah's money in Iran, and a director of the Pahlavi Foundation. When he resigned from office, he was working for the Shah, and he helped the Pahlavi Foundation put up their offices in New York City, a conduit of CIA oil money. How can a private family like the Rockefellers or a private business have so much influence in the State Department? I said last November when the hostages were taken and Jimmy Carter couldn't release them within a week that America had reached the turning point of its power to influence events around the world. And if you follow it each week and run through it, you'll see what I mean. The past year, I'm going to talk about Jimmy Carter just quickly, and I did want to get to Abscam, but some of this is so important not to lose sight of. In the last year, the Shah was out of power. Somoza was out of power in Nicaragua, and Park was out of power in Korea. The next countries to go will be El Salvador and probably Taiwan and the Philippines and possibly Saudi Arabia. In the last year, there was elections in Rhodesia. South Africa simply has to take note of what's going on there. And the real story of the storming of Mecca is a top secret because of the weakness of the royal family in Saudi Arabia and the conflicts going on there at this time. Colombia is divided, and South American countries. El Salvador is in the throes of a revolution. The United States is still funding El Salvador, but no matter, even if Jimmy Carter was hand-picked by David Rockefeller and Mr. Brzezinski, they do not control the thinking of the world anymore. That's why it's so important with tapes like this and articles that I'm getting from the newspaper and books that are available to read and study, because the forces of history are moving now, and these individuals no longer have the control that they think they had. The British announced this week that they're going to compete in the Olympics. The killing of that priest in El Salvador will only unite the people against the United States. I read this week the United States keeps sending arms to El Salvador, but that brutal slaying of this fine Catholic priest, this Marxist, Mr. Romero, shot at Mass, can do nothing but turn people on to what is going on to the United States if we keep sending them arms. There's rumor of a coup in Pakistan, that Mohammed Zia al-Haq is so unstable. He's the most flaky character in the world, and there's no way that we can keep sending weapons to these characters. The days of the Shah are over. There was a scheduled plot to get him. It didn't work, but believe me, he's walking on jello. He's so afraid of what's going to happen, that Russia will come in, that he couldn't take our minimum 43 million that he didn't want anyway. But the government is corrupt, and it's going, and Colombia has its own internal problems where the far right wing is losing its power, the military dictatorship. Charles Kraus has a marvelous article this week about a woman, Regine Bendecourt de Lisca, known as Regina the 11th, who is running against communism and against the military dictatorship, and she's a tremendous power in Colombia, and her message is health, money, and love. I mean, those are the things that I would run on if I could run for office in this country, too. She has a following of hundreds of thousands of people, and she has free dental clinics, employment agencies, and she gives people subsidized hot meals. She's very pro-American. She's not a communist, but she has a lot of appeal, and there's a fascinating article. She claims that the government has never done anything for the poor, and if you believe in reincarnation or not, she was close as a child. She met the Pope Angelo Roncalli, John the 23rd, that very gentle, fine Pope who I said died in the spring, early summer, just before John Kennedy was murdered. Kennedy and this Pope had a lot in common and would have made peace in the world. She met him, and some of this rubbed off on her, and she claimed that Colombian politicians have never done anything for the poor, that she doesn't like poverty, that they've never done anything for education, that they've closed the hospitals, that they allow drugs to destroy the youth, that they've stolen a lot from the people. And this woman is a big influence working in Colombia. She's becoming a political force. She's winning elections. She's a woman who was inspired by a decent man, and the forces of good can influence you to take these actions, which she's doing, and get popular with the political people and hold positions of office in Bogota. She holds 2 city council jobs, and she's carrying on her work for mankind, as I say, not as a communist, but as a person. And these sound like cliches, don't they, like Valentine's? But good health and money and love, and if you have those, I believe you can conquer a lot. And she's something to observe. Her name is Regine Bendecourt de Lisca. They call her Regina the 11th, and she's getting very active politically in Colombia with a huge following. Jimmy Carter is calling for an extra vise on exports bound for the Soviet Union and to tighten up the technology bound for the Soviet Union. I have to tell you, it's an exercise in futility. It's simply like an oral masturbation. Remember, after Chiang Kai-shek was out in China, we were not going to give them technology. We weren't going to work with China. We stayed away from them. We didn't exchange trade. We didn't exchange culture. China survived. We're going bankrupt. This country's going bankrupt. And I just read this week that China has the missiles to reach the United States now. They had the hydrogen bomb without the United States aid, and now they have missiles that can hit the United States shores. That's 1 billion people that have been ostracized and kept from knowing or exchanging with major nations such as the United States, and they have technology. There isn't any reason to believe that what Jimmy Carter is doing to the Soviet Union because of Afghanistan makes a bit of difference. He wants to look like a strong leader, but the more he makes promises and the less he delivers, the more ridiculous it becomes. There's articles in the paper this week, plane readiness report stirs dispute. The Pentagon would like to make war, but they've reported the U.S. airplanes aren't ready to go into battle. They don't think they could do it. Another one, a draft registration snag over a fund shift legislation. They can't get the money together. They have to cut off from one pocket to do the other to even get a draft together. The country's bankrupt, and they can't even transfer the $13 million it would be to get the list going. So we talk about war and holding back technology, but the one good thing is that we're not really ready, and by the time we're ready, the other nations will be smarter. Just as London's going into, or Great Britain is going over the Olympic Games, we're just going to look awfully silly and dumb because the problems in the Middle East we brought on, we won't apologize for them, and nobody wants to get involved with that Rockefeller, Kissinger, Williams profit system that we've brought a lot of chaos around the world, and the other countries are watching us and they don't want to be a part of it. I've done many tapes on the moon projects and the moon space stations, and I will get back to those after a few weeks of abscam, but I just want to bring out three articles that were in the news just recently before we lose sight of them. One was San Jose Mercury. The Santa Clara University is going to have a study of space robots this summer. There's going to be American Engineering Society for Engineering Education involving a $202,000 grant. The question to be brought was how much work will be done on the moon by robots and how much by humans. They're going to have long-term work with space stations and mining and construction projects. And the summer project this summer will be to see how long humans can stay on certain jobs and what can be done on robots so that they have a division of labor. Another article, NASA gives police power to captains of spaceships. This was in the Washington Post. NASA announced that the captain of the spaceship can discipline various persons. They can lock them in the bathroom until they land, that they have the authority with somebody in space to charge a crime and punish $5,000, and that they can use brute force. The main point about the meeting was to use brute force, that you can knock it out, that they're making reservations for space shuttles, and if there's any problem or fighting or a difference or mutiny on those shuttles, that you can knock a person down. And they said we need a rule like that because when the Apollos go up, those various moon ships and shuttle ships, there has to be some law. There were problems once on an airline in 1956, and also an Arctic case where when they were out at sea, they didn't know who had authority. So somebody in space has to make authority and use any means necessary, including physical force. So they worked this week on the law that you can use brute force when you're up in space if necessary, that the captain of the ship becomes the judge and the prosecutor at the time. He makes the decision and carries it out. Some countries are objecting to this law. They don't think that's fair. They have other nationalities that have made reservations for the space shuttle, and they're objecting to being tried in these cases, but they've been ruled out, and visitors from other countries will have to obey the laws on the spaceship, and the captain will be the one to dish out the punishment. There's also a problem with the Moon Treaty. There's a group called L.5. That is the group making arrangements for these weightless factories, and the L.5 has 3,600 members, and they have frightened Jimmy Carter. Now they have a secret committee meeting on a treaty that involves the Defense Department, the CIA, the National Aeronautics and Space Agency, and the State, Treasury, and Commerce departments. It has to do with taking minerals from the moon and using them privately for corporations or sharing them. The Moon Treaty. It has to do with iron, aluminum, titanium, and other minerals. And there's a lawyer, Birmingham aerospace lawyer, who's working with the L5 group. That's Barry Goldwater, Senator Barry Goldwater from Arizona, Richard Heinlein, who writes space science fiction, and Lee Ratner, a Washington lobbyist. And they claim that it would be space socialism to share the rocks and minerals with other countries, and they don't want to sign a moon treaty. France and Chile have signed it, and some people believe that the moon belongs to everybody, but these corporations, the Kennecott Copper Corporation and so forth, are involved with these men that I've mentioned, and the L5 group. They don't want to have international socialism. This is capitalism at its best. Whoever gets up there gets the minerals, and they have put off any signing or agreements because Jimmy Carter is afraid of their secret committee meetings on this treaty, and I guess we'll have to wait till after elections to see what they decide. I bring out these moon treaties and these laws and space laws that are coming out now because there's many of you that are concerned with the past history, who refuse to understand what is being told to us about the plans for the space colonies and the slave labor and the possible genocide up there, similar to what the Nazis did at the rocket factories in Germany. To refuse to read these articles is to not be able to meet the future and to fight these people that are lobbying now for the control of the space colonies, both the resources and the riches, and control the crime problems and everything else. It'll be in the hands of a few up there. On side 2 of this tape, we'll go on to abscam and murder of crime figures and interconnecting murders that are taking place at the present time. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 434, and it's side 2, March 28th, 1980. The night that the Abscam story broke, Arab scam, Arab investigation, FBI investigation, payoffs, the very evening that that story broke, in February of this year, was the night that 33 inmates were killed in the New Mexico jail. You notice the wall of silence since that event. It's like Jonestown, where 923 died. There's been absolute silence about investigating and going into the matter where these inmates were killed. And the inmates there were informants or informers, and they had valuable information to share. Either they had testified or were about to testify in important cases. Since Abscam story broke, they have just briefly gone into hinting the My Porn, the pornography investigation, the Pensdorf, Alan Dorfman and Senator Howard Cannon, the Chicago-Vegas connections, the Bry Lab involving the Southwest, their investigations into New Jersey, New York, the Immigration Department, the gaming casinos and how they're procured, and hit squads and assassins and passports in exchange for favor. The Abscam has been very quiet in the news, but because there's so much information, it will be boiling over, and we'll go into it more. But I was very concerned about not only the death of those 33 inmates and informers, but the fact that Raymond Precunier, who used to be head of the prison system in California, where we had the FBI and CIA working and was under sheriff in San Francisco at the time, had been to New Mexico prior to the time that the killings took place. The place was stocked with drugs that were available. The files had the names of the informers, and they were able to get the keys and go in and kill them. This past week, there was a rampage inside the Newark, New Jersey jail, just at a time when New Jersey people, high officials, are being investigated, and the 10th floor was held off by, they had 8 hostages, and so far the toll of personal bodily damage isn't really revealed, but the riot took place where in the unit for suspected murderers and other violent offenders, and I'm wondering how many prison deaths and murdering of witnesses inside the prison system are going to take place in the next 5 or 10 years in order to silence the truth of what transpired out on the streets. Of course, we know that Jack Ruby, a witness to the John Kennedy assassination and involved in wiping out Lee Harvey Oswald, got what was called a 3-week cancer and started to get injections after he smuggled out letters from the jail that stated that there was a high-level conspiracy involving the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, and other top officials. And Joseph Valachi promised to give information on organized crime if he had protection, and then he was killed in jail, and Mickey Cohn was almost killed in jail. And as soon as Jimmy Hoffa got out, he was murdered by people who were kept out and didn't have to go to jail if they would murder Jimmy Hoffa. A lot of informers are wiped out in the jail, but this New Mexico situation is coming the same night as the 2-year investigation of the FBI into international and national organized crime was very important. And then several weeks ago, or just a little over a week ago, there was an article in the San Francisco newspapers, probably didn't make the Eastern or national news at all. Raymond Precunier, that's that same San Francisco undersheriff that I've talked about on the tapes, is leaving San Francisco. I heard he was leaving San Francisco, and I thought he would be fired and in disgrace for having participated in things that transpired down there in New Mexico, but it's the other way around. He's now going to New Mexico to investigate the state penitentiary and be a consultant. The San Francisco Chronicle said he will be assisting in investigating the devastating riot as former director of prisons in California. he was familiar with deaths and riots. This having Berkowitz investigate the New Mexico riots is like having Himmler investigate Auschwitz. The people who set it up are sent there to investigate it, and it's outrageous that Raymond Berkowitz, with a history of California violences and provocateurs, is allowed to go to New Mexico now. And as I say, there's a wall of silence about what transpired. The Los Angeles Times had an article which wasn't in the Chronicle. That's why I say it's so important to have a cross-file of these articles. This article is about the New Mexico riot, and it said the prison was a powder keg waiting for a match to drop. And it talks about the predictable savagery of the inmates in there. The psychiatrists say what they're trying to say is it was a powder keg and that 33 inmates were killed. And the expert they use in the article, or even if it went nationally, to say that it was inevitable they die was a Frank Ervin, a psychiatrist at McGill University in Montreal and an expert on violence. And then the article quotes what he talked about, brain lesions and psychotic thought, and it goes on to quote Dr. Jolly West, the chairman of psychiatry at UCLA, and the savagery that goes on in the prisons. Well, I drew a diagram of some of the people involved in these prison violences and the UCLA school to study the cause of violent behavior that was supposed to take place, and I've referred to it on other tapes. It's in the full Senate report of Sam Ervin on constitutional rights, individual rights, and the federal role in behavior modification. And in this Senate hearing, Sam Ervin, before he left the Senate following the Watergate investigations, wrote a letter to the LEAA administrator, Don Santarelli, and he asked him about the UCLA school. This letter was dated January 14th, 1974. That was 6 years ago. And he said, on March 22nd of last year, I addressed an inquiry concerning LEAA funding the violence studies at UCLA, called the Study and Reduction of Violence at UCLA. And Sam Ervin wrote, I want more information about this group. He said, since last March, I have asked for information pertaining to the UCLA Center. And he said, I asked whether Dr. William Sweet, Dr. Vernon Mark, or Dr. Frank Ervin will perform any of the work at UCLA project. And he said, you sent me a lot of information with considerable detail, but there was no specific reply to this question. It was omitted. I understand that Dr. Sweet and Ervin are now associated with the neuropsychiatric at UCLA. This report of Sam Ervin's committee in the Senate goes on and talks about electrode implants and Dr. Frank Ervin and Dr. Sweet, and the fact that they have 4 projects using LEAA funds, and a very controversial one in Puerto Rico. This was in 1974. Now, I know there were planes leaving Jonestown and the airport there, Port Katoomey, with flying people to Puerto Rico, and I believed at the time, because of various documents I had, that they were being transferred for medical experimentation and electrode implants. The Senate report goes into the Los Angeles Police Department. James Fisk, a former high-ranking officer in the police department working with the UCLA school, and it refers to the January 1973 State of the State message of Governor Ronald Reagan announcing this Center for the Reduction of Life-Threatening Behavior. The report goes on and says that they secretly do lobotomies on people in the California prisons, and these people get more violent, and that they use chemical castration, psychosurgery, experimental drugs, and suggest that in an age of rapidly advancing technology, that it does not preserve human dignity and principles of liberty or freedom to have such an institution. And in this report of UCLA, they refer, on my Jonestown tapes, I've mentioned the fingerprinting process and the secret Nike base for electrode implants and making people literally prisoners of the medical part of the prison system, taking their brains away from them. Well, Dr. Frank Ervin is an expert on surfacing, and Dr. Jolly West on the New Mexico prison riots, and they're calling in Raymond Berkowitz, who worked with Ervin and West at UCLA and were to transport prisoners for these experimentations. To summarize this, and it's terribly important because This is where the prison worked with Ronald Reagan. He set up this school to study the causes of violence on blacks, Indians, Chicanos, and the poor. He worked with Dr. West from UCLA, who worked with the CIA all of his life and was Jack Ruby's, in quotes, psychiatrist for his 1-minute epilepsy. They used secret night bases, and these three men on the printed sheet that goes with this tape, I'm spelling out their names so whenever you see them, Dr. Vernon Mark, Dr. William Sweet, and Dr. Frank Ervin. I mentioned last week that they're the ones that did the psychosurgery and electrode implants on a gentleman, Leonard Keeley, who is similar to the Dennis Sweeney that shot Alan Lowenstein, that I mentioned last week. These are the same doctors talking about the New Mexico riot that put the electro implants back at the Boston hospital, that work for the CIA, the Defense Department, and are experimenting on humans. And so the New Mexico investigation is now being done by Raymond Percunier, who left San Francisco to take over the job where 33 informers were brutally murdered. And those informers, I know, would link heavily to the AB scam. But going back over the years, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 6, in watching the relationship of these people to various government, provocateur, instigated crimes, you have to believe that the New Mexico story will be very hushed, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of prosecutions or who they can try to nail for these murders when they actually did them a favor by wiping out their patsies. I'm sure that many people that did the murders have already escaped and been transferred somewhere else. On tape 431, March the 8th, 1980, or was it March the 7th? March the 7th. I talked about a hitman for organized crime by the name of Charles Allen, who confessed he was a hitman and that he worked with the Teamsters people that were involved with wiping out Jimmy Hoffa, and that he became a confidential government informant, Mr. Allen, in 1977 and 1979. And he was testifying against a gentleman who also was involved with, he alleged had murdered 2 people and had been on contract to kill other people. A racketeer, part of the Teamsters operation. It was a trial of a man named Francis J. Sheeran, president of the Wilmington, Delaware Teamsters Group. Well, Allen is a government informant who was talking about giving $40,000 to John Mitchell to get a prison release of Hoffa, and working with Richard Nixon and the White House staff, and also as part of a hit team. Now, Allen was testifying in the course of his trial. The trial took place in Turnsville, New Jersey, and he was testifying there as an informant about Angelo Bruno, who's the chief don of the New Jersey, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania organized crime, the whole northern section, and that's a pretty big hunk. And just right after Mr. Allen's testimony, Angelo Bruno was murdered. He was murdered last week. Bruno himself was becoming an informant. You see, all of them would go to jail and get the death penalty for their multiple murders if they didn't turn informant. So the killers are out on the streets, and the men who are talking about the killing or even took part in them are being gunned down. Now, Bruno had been working for the government, giving information about several people, important people that I've referred to. 2 of them are bosses, cousins of crime boss Carlo Gambino. That name runs through these tapes constantly, with the Vatican connections, the Carter connections, the New York connections, the large Italy, Vatican, Watergate ball of wax. Well, Bruno was giving information about the Gambino brothers. They were arrested, charged with conspiracy of $1 million of heroin traffic recently, distributing Rosario and Giuseppe Gambino. And Angelo Bruno was testifying about them as a government official. He was in the New Jersey State Commission investigation offices. Last Thursday, he was on the 10th floor in Trenton, New Jersey, and then he was behind closed doors testifying about rackets in South Jersey, and then he went downstairs and was gunned down. His associate was hurt, but he was killed. So that one of the major, last of the large dons of organized crime, Angelo Bruno, has been wiped out. That doesn't mean crime's been wiped out. It means that the heroin, cocaine, hash, marijuana is in the hands of a different team. But he's one of the last of the old mobster syndicates, and when he began to tell the feds about information that he had, and when Charles Allen began to give information that Bruno also had of murders, then Angelo Bruno was gunned down. Up to this day, Charles Allen is alive, but Bruno is a biggie, and I'm sure that he knows the links of the White House and John Mitchell and John Ehrlichman and Robert Haldeman and Richard Nixon, the entire White House team of various murders and assassinations that were done by a combination of the Central Intelligence Agency and organized crime. Now, all these murders had to go into place to kill John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, affect the Chappaquiddick accident of Mary Jo Kopechne, the shooting of George Wallace, the killing of Jimmy Hoffa. The connecting links are being all wiped out and erased, and these people participated in murders, and some were informers. But again, Angelo Bruno was gunned down last week, shortly after Charles Allen turned in information about Bruno's knowledge of various murders. Of course, the news media is making it appear that this is an interwar between organized crime between each other. But all of these people have been involved, as I say, in Chappaquiddick, in the Wallace shooting, in the John Kennedy assassination, the Robert Kennedy assassination, and in Watergate, and they had to be wiped out also with the Abscam international investigations going on. Just save your newspaper and, as I say, watch the murders escalate. I have many, many books on these crime families and Angelo Bruno. Some good books. I referred last week to the book The Hoffa Wars, or the week before. There's another book, The Malachi Papers, and there's an excellent book by Gay Talese, Honor Thy Father. It's the story of the Bonanno family, organized crime with charts of families, and there's a lot in there about Angelo Bruno. And there's a lot in this book about the way the FBI sets up a war between organized crime to make it look like other crime members are wiping out each other, and then the FBI takes a back seat and lets them erase the witnesses that they've used for their own purposes of murder and make it look like a war between members of organized crime. In Honor Thy Father, there's a section here that tells about a bombing at the home of Joseph Bonanno, the crime lord, in Tucson, Arizona, and how the suspect worked for used aircraft and had learned demolition in the Marine Corps. And then the agent that actually did the bombings was an FBI agent named Dave. He was in charge of the mafia affairs in Arizona. And the FBI disguised their agents into the crime syndicate and hope that the crime syndicate will kill each other off, which they do sometimes, and then the federal agencies won't be involved for wiping these people out. They can blame other members of crime families that they're competing with for narcotics or territory. This world is so crazy and mixed up that everything is totally topsy-turvy, and a perfect example of it is a case of a San Francisco mobster right now who's being prosecuted. He worked for the Teamsters Union, and he's being charged, Rudy Tham, 56 years old, for taking union funds from the Teamster, $2,000, a little more with some rough change, to spend on food and lodging and entertainment, that he went to hotels and used this money for private business and travel and food. This is just a little over $2,000, and Rudy Tham is the man being prosecuted. I didn't even know they had trials for people stealing $2,000 anymore. I thought they were done out of court. And the witness against this man, Mr. Tham, Rudy Tham, is James Jimmy the Weasel Fratriano. And Fratriano has admitted to doing at least 5 murders. He's been threatened with the electric chair. He has been known to do anywhere from 5 to 10 or 11 murders. And he's testified in this trial. He's admitted that he's choked people, that he's shot them, that he's thrown them out of cars. And Mr. Tham says, you're just testifying against me so that you won't get a death sentence in Cleveland for murders that you did. So I don't understand why the government uses a man like Fratriano. Fratriano was getting between $10,000 and $17,000 a month as a government informant from 1970 to 77 when he was doing murders. He talks about the bombing of Danny Green's home in Cleveland in 1977 and the shooting of Frank Bompensero in San Diego in 1977, and he tells about choking people in the car and killing them with a rope. And all of his murders, in the course of the trial, he personally tells that he helped kill Frank Nichelli, Tony Trombino, Tony Braccato, Frank Borgia, and Russian Louis Strauss. And he tells how he, as I say, he choked them, he walked behind them with a rope, threw them out of the car, he fired one with a gun, he participated in another. The main prosecution witness is telling a fatal headshot in the back seat of a car and how he was getting rid of these people. Braccato was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. And this is the main prosecution witness. So the defendant is somebody who took less than $3,000, and the man testifying against him for the whole story is somebody who has participated in these gangland murders and been paid for them as a government foreman all the time that he was doing them. I don't know why for $2,791 the prosecution is going after Mr. Tham, and the witness that they're using is an admitted killer who was being paid by the government and wiping out these people in brutal murders. Why that murder isn't just locked up for good instead of being on the stand and given a new identity and thousands of dollars each year by our taxes to protect him as a witness when he's through with this. I don't understand at all how a mass murder like that is a prosecution witness and the defendant is talking for less than $3,000 that he spent on food and hotel bills. I'm collecting endless articles linking Jimmy Carter to organized crime, to the mafia down in Atlanta, Georgia, and in Atlantic City and Las Vegas. The interesting report, I call this the Cartergate. I've called Abscam. It could become the Cartergate all along. The New York Times, March the 12th, has an article under the title Impropriety Alleged in Gibson Inquiry. Now, this has to do with allegations that the Carter administration interfered under the investigation. A mayor of Newark, his name is Kenneth Gibson, was being investigated, and that George Katz, a friend of Senator Williams, who's involved in the Abscam story, interceded and said that he would go to Washington officials to try to get the mayor off the hook. So Mr. Katz is part of an organized crime group, and he works with the garbage collection, that tanglement that's being investigated with the New Jersey Abscam. And so Mr. Katz volunteered George Katz to see what he could do. Now the story goes that Mr. Katz tried to help the mayor by going to President Carter and former Attorney General Griffin Bell and Senator Williams, and that they mentioned the possible involvement of Robert S. Strauss, the president's re-election campaign chairman, and Robert Del Tufo, the United States attorney appointed by Jimmy Carter to New Jersey. Now, the 2 years that they've been investigating organized crime and the Democratic Party and the mob and the syndicate in New Jersey, the investigator was appointed by Jimmy Carter, and a lot of these people work with Jimmy Carter. This New York Times story says that Mr. Del Tufo and Mr. Strauss were mentioned as being instrumental in stopping or trying to stop the investigation of Mayor Gibson, and that there was a conversation with him, and such as, we don't go to Washington because it'll look wrong if we help you, but we'll help you at the New Jersey and with this criminal investigation that you're under, that the mayor was under. And in order to cover up the possible corruption of the mayor of Newark, this Kenneth Gibson, Jimmy Carter sent him away down to the Panama Canal signing tree to make him look like he was acceptable in the national, international figures, and sent him down to Torrijos, another narcotics dealer down in Panama. So he tried to give him a public image as being appointed by the mayor of getting the kosher seal of approval. And while he was down in Panama, there were more stories that linked about Mayor Gibson, and that he was under investigation. These stories started linking in October 1979 when he was in Panama, that he was under criminal investigation, and that he was linked to $75,000 discovered in a Swiss bank account, and it was in the mayor's name, and it was controlled by him. Mayor Kenneth Gibson is under investigation, and on December 13th of this year, he publicly said that he would support Jimmy Carter in his campaign in New Jersey. Now, Senator Williams and Representative Frank Thompson of Trenton, who've been caught in the Abscam net, were working on the election of Senator Ted Kennedy. One way that Jimmy Carter can control a lot of votes and the bosses all over the country with the syndicate and organized crime is that they can be threatened with investigation if they don't support him, and he can take a big hunk of the Democratic Party throughout the whole South that is linked to Brylab, Abscam, and the other investigations, the pornography scams, and he can keep these people from being prosecuted or tried by giving them appointments and sending them places and officially recognizing them in the White House. So Carter and the White House have been linked to helping hide the investigation of the Newark, New Jersey Mayor Kenneth Gibson. Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti is letting most of the people linked to Carter and organized crime off the hook because he's to Jimmy Carter what John Mitchell was to Richard Nixon. And someday I'll try to remember to do a tape on the links of Jimmy Carter to the Bahamas and Robert Vesco and organized crime and go at depth into many of the links of Carter to the crime figures. I'm getting articles from people in the East on different investigations and suggestions of crime links to Carter going back to 1976, 77, 78, which become important now when the FBI is trying to investigate some criminals without letting it rub off on Carter, and that's why I call this Cartergate, because eventually his organized crime connections will surface. Although it is very important to save all articles of people that are being murdered and hit-and-run cases and airplane accidents, and you can always throw them away later, but save them in case there's some connecting links. The strange case of this Dr. Tarnower in New York City is an important case because of the background of the woman, the headmistress, Jean Harris, who shot him. Jean Harris was brought up in Cleveland, went to a private girls' school, then went to Smith College and studied history and economics, and then went to Grosse Pointe, Michigan, where she was living in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and had a family and taught at a day school. Ms. Harris went to the Soviet Union in 1958, a time when the CIA was sending people under the guise of wanting to understand the Russian language or the Russian people. She had a good education, and she came home from the Soviet Union, gave lectures about her trip, and in 1964 was described as well organized, and the Washington Post article describes her activities and her promotions as a school assistant. In 1964, she filed for a divorce, and then shortly after, in 1977, her husband died, and she left Michigan and became director of a school called Chestnut Hill in Philadelphia. And she worked in the middle of the social scene in Philadelphia where she met this Dr. Tarnower. Now, I won't have time on the tape. I'm going to have to leave off just at this point. But she worked for a company called Allied Maintenance that did janitor work for the Madison Square Garden. She worked there for a year and a half and a salary of $32,000 before she went to McLean, Virginia, to this fancy school. And I have articles on organized crime and members of the crime syndicate with clinging services. I did one tape on Meet Esposito, and he had a group called the Broadway Maintenance Company. And the next week I want to do about the Moonies and their clinging service, clinging the space satellite stations and the Fort Ord and the Army bases, the military and FBI offices, and the links of Esposito to the Moonies, and the Madison Square Garden group linked to people in New York of the crime family. She worked for them before she went there, and the mystery of who Dr. Tarnower is has never really been exposed. I believe that this Jean Harris has a double personality like Candy Jones that we have to study. For those of you who don't know, Candy Jones was a woman, a model, worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, who was given a double personality, one by the name of Arlene Grant, and did various jobs for the Central Intelligence Agency, and then switched roles and went back to the other person, Candy Jones, when she wasn't working for the CIA. From the description of this Mrs. Harris, she seemed to have this double personality, and the mystery of Dr. Tarnower, how he accumulated that vast wealth, the story behind it has a lot more to be told. As I say, there isn't time on this tape, so I'll get to it, but I just wanted to mention this little bit so that if you have articles on clinging companies and organized crime and maintenance crews and the ownership of the Madison Square Garden, just send it on out to me. I'd appreciate it. And we'll go into this more because I guess I'm getting into this backwards. We'll talk about the people involved with Abscam that are being killed first and then get to Abscam. But each week I keep pushing it off because there's things in the news that I want to update before we get back to that. And hopefully next week maybe I'll just stick with that no matter what happens. But I do like to tie in these loose ends of past investigations, such as the Son of Sam or the Alternative 3, the space stations, and so forth. So that's all for today. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. I'll be back with you next week, and you take care.